The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of spectators and the impatient rustle of legal briefs. Fluorescent lights glared down from the high ceiling, flattening the faces of those present into a single shade of tension. Dr. Amara Gaines sat at the defendant's table, her spine perfectly straight, her hands calm but cold in her lap. She wore a navy blue suit, understated jewelry, and minimal makeup, the kind of attire she'd worn hundreds of times to hospital board meetings. But this wasn't a hospital. This was a courtroom. And she was not here as an expert witness or celebrated surgeon, she was here as a defendant. Across the room, the plaintiff's attorney leaned into his desk with a smugness that made Amara's skin crawl. Next to him sat Dr. Kurt Halberd, her former colleague, now enemy, his mouth twisted into a permanent smirk. The same smirk he wore after she rejected his advances, the same one she saw when he tried to undermine her surgical decisions. The same one that had followed her into this courtroom under the guise of a malpractice suit. The judge entered, a tall, gray-haired man in his 60s with an air of detached authority. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at the file in front of him, then let his gaze sweep over the room. When his eyes landed on Amara, they paused, narrowed slightly. His lips pressed into a thin line, betraying a flicker of something: doubt? Disbelief. Court is now in session, the bailiff called out. As both sides rose, Amara felt a flicker of the same steel she summoned in the trauma bay when a patient was bleeding out in front of her. This was no different, she told herself. A crisis. A test of precision under pressure. The stakes were her name, her work, her dignity. The judge cleared his throat and looked directly at her. Dr. Gaines, he began, drawing out the title, as if testing its legitimacy. You're the attending physician named in the plaintiff's complaint? Yes, Your Honor, Amara said clearly. He glanced again at the folder, then raised an eyebrow. You don't look like a doctor. A pause fell over the room, stunned, electric. The plaintiff's side chuckled softly. Amara didn't flinch. I assure you, Your Honor, she replied, my credentials are in order. The judge made a noncommittal sound and waved a hand toward the prosecution. Let's proceed. The plaintiff's lawyer stood and began spinning a tale of recklessness, poor judgment, a patient who suffered needlessly under Dr. Gaines' care. He used phrases like gross negligence and pattern of behavior, crafting a story meant to erode the foundation of Amara's career. He painted her as distracted, careless, unfit, though never said aloud what was implied in every carefully chosen word, that she didn't belong where she was. Amara's attorney, David Ling, sat beside her, taking notes furiously, his jaw tight. When the prosecution rested for the day, the judge dismissed court until morning. As the room emptied, Amara stayed seated, staring at the seal of the state of Illinois behind the bench. You okay? David asked quietly. She nodded. I've been underestimated before. David sighed, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. That comment from the judge, it was out of line. We can file an objection, ask for a transcript review. No, she said firmly. Let him think what he wants. By the time this is over, he'll have to see me for what I am. Outside the courthouse, the wind whipped sharply down LaSalle Street, catching the hem of Amara's coat. She paused on the steps, scanning the city she'd served for more than 2 decades. Chicago had taught her how to be hard when she needed to be, how to care deeply without falling apart, how to survive storms, literal and otherwise. It had also taught her that some battles were fought not in trauma bays, but in rooms like this, where reputation bled just as slowly and dangerously as an open wound. As she walked toward the waiting car, her phone buzzed. A message from the hospital's board chair lit up the screen. Hang in there. The letter is signed. We'll send it to the court in the morning. We've got your back. She allowed herself the faintest smile. The letter. It wouldn't erase the judge's words, but it would speak louder than any insult. It would carry the weight of truth. She tucked the phone away, not slowing her pace. The city roared around her, indifferent, alive, relentless. Just like her, tomorrow, the Real defense would begin. The morning after the judge's remark, the courthouse hallway felt colder than usual, not from the air, but from the stairs. Whispers trailed behind Dr. Amara Gaines as she walked through security. That's her. Did you hear what the judge said? She doesn't even look like a surgeon. Amara didn't flinch. She'd spent most of her adult life being doubted, too young, too composed, too quiet, too black. Every operating room she entered demanded that she reprove herself. Every time she saved a life, it only half counted to people who couldn't reconcile her face with their idea of a hero in scrubs. She stepped into the courtroom precisely at 8:58 a.m., 2 minutes before session resumed. Her attorney, David Ling, was already there, reviewing his notes. A fresh suit, but the same exhausted eyes. You ready? He asked, glancing up. I've been ready since they filed this, she replied, her voice steady. He gave a tight nod. The letter came in just after midnight. I had it notarized and sent a certified copy to the court this morning. The original's right here. He tapped his briefcase. She exhaled quietly, a mix of relief and resolve. Let them see it. The courtroom filled slowly, the usual crowd of legal assistants, observers, and a few journalists seated near the back. The judge entered, expression unreadable. He didn't look at Amara as he took his seat. Maybe he remembered his words. Maybe he didn't care. Let's proceed, he said, adjusting his robe. David rose. Your Honor, before we call our first witness, we'd like to submit a letter into evidence, a signed document from the Board of Directors at St. Catherine Medical Center, where Dr. Gaines has worked for over 15 years. The judge raised an eyebrow. A letter? Yes, Your Honor. It directly addresses the allegations raised in the complaint. The bailiff took the folder from David and brought it to the bench. The judge opened it slowly, scanning the first few lines. His jaw moved slightly as he read. The room fell into a stillness so complete that even the rustling of papers stopped. To whom it may concern, the letter began. This letter is submitted in full and unanimous support of Dr. Amara Gaines, who has served as chief trauma surgeon at St. Catherine Medical Center since 2012. Her judgment, integrity, and clinical excellence have saved countless lives under the most extreme conditions. We categorically refute the suggestion that her decisions on March 4 constituted malpractice. The incident in question was reviewed internally by a panel of 5 independent physicians. No deviation from standard of care was found. The judge read silently for a moment longer, then looked up, eyes less certain than the day before. Noted, he said curtly, setting the letter aside. Proceed with your first witness. David called the hospital's lead nurse, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carmen Lopez. She walked to the stand with the calm precision of someone used to chaos, the calm that only came from years in trauma wards, blood on her gloves, adrenaline in her bones. I've worked with Dr. Gaines for 11 years, she said firmly. There is no one I trust more in a crisis. She's the surgeon we call when everyone else is panicking. David nodded. Can you describe the March 4 incident from your perspective? Carmen's voice never wavered. She described the ER. That night, 4 incoming trauma cases within 12 minutes, all severe. A gunshot wound, a ruptured spleen, a compound fracture, and the plaintiff's son, a 15-year-old with internal bleeding from a car crash. She triaged correctly, Carmen said. The gunshot victim was losing blood the fastest. She delegated care to the appropriate teams and took the most critical case herself. And the boy? He was stable when he arrived. His vitals were monitored. He was taken to the ER 30 minutes later, and he recovered. David turned toward the judge. Did any physician or nurse on shift raise concerns about Dr. Gaines' decision that night? No, Carmen said flatly. Only Dr. Halberd. And not until 2 weeks later, after Dr. Gaines was promoted over him. A quiet murmur ran through the room. The judge shifted slightly in his chair. Across the aisle, Dr. Halberd's expression cracked for the first time. The smirk faded. Amara didn't allow herself to look at him. Her focus stayed on the testimony, on the facts, on the truth being laid bare. But inside, something tightened and then slowly began to release, like a stitch coming loose. After months of strain, when court adjourned for lunch, Amara stepped into the hallway and leaned against the cold marble wall. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. David finally exhaled beside her. We're turning the tide. She nodded once. The truth usually floats. It just takes time to rise. As they walked toward the elevators, a woman approached from the public seating area. Late 30s, sharp features, tears in her eyes. She reached for Amara's hand. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said softly. My daughter, you operated on her 2 years ago after a bus accident. They said she might never walk again. Amara's eyes softened. She's okay now? She's running track. The woman's voice broke. I never got to say thank you. Amara offered a faint smile, brushing her fingers gently against the woman's. You just did. And for the first time in weeks, the weight on Amara's shoulders felt slightly lighter. Tomorrow would bring more battles. Cross-examinations, spin, manipulation. But today, she had turned the tide. And she knew who she was. The third day of trial dawned gray and wet. Rain tapped against the windows of Amara's apartment like an insistent question. She stood at the bathroom sink, her reflection staring back at her, puffy eyes from too little sleep, a faint crease between her brows that hadn't been there 5 years ago. She smoothed her edges, tied her hair back into a tight bun, and reached for the deep maroon lipstick she reserved for moments when she needed to feel armored. As she applied it, her hands hesitated for a second. The voice in her head, too familiar, whispered, "You're trying too hard." Another voice pushed back, "No, you're showing up." Downstairs, her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother, Marcus. I watched the live stream clip. That judge really said that? You know what? Screw him. We see you, sis. And so do they. Keep going. She smiled faintly, then slid the phone into her coat pocket. Marcus had always been her biggest cheerleader, even when they were kids. Even when their mother had worked double shifts as a nurse in Bronzeville, telling them both, "You'll have to be twice as good to get half the credit." At 9:30 a.m., she and David entered the courtroom together, the air thick with the tension of a case that was starting to shift under the prosecution's feet. The judge called the room to order. Today's witness was scheduled to be Dr. Kurt Halbert himself. Amara sat still, her expression neutral, while Kurt walked up to the stand. He wore a finely tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled, his face arranged into concern. But she knew him too well. He wasn't worried, he was calculating. David leaned over and whispered, "Just watch. He's going to pivot. Play the reasonable guy now." He did exactly that. "I never meant for this to escalate," Kurt began. "I simply raised concerns internally after what I perceived to be a misjudgment. I wanted what was best for the patient." David stood. "Dr. Halbert, can you clarify when you raised these concerns?" 2 weeks after the event. I was reviewing the surgical logs." David nodded. "And during those 2 weeks, did you speak directly with Dr. Gaines?" "No." "Did you submit any official complaint to hospital administration?" "No. I only shared my thoughts with other colleagues." David tilted his head. "Were any of those colleagues also up for the chief position that Dr. Gaines was later selected for?" Kurt shifted. "I don't know everyone's intentions." David stepped closer. "Did you or did you not send an email to the hospital board the day after Dr. Gaines' promotion, citing troubling patterns in her surgical practice?" The courtroom held its breath. "I did. But only because Your Honor," David interrupted, holding up a printed email. "We'd like to enter this into evidence. The email from Dr. Halbert is timestamped less than 24 hours after Drive Gaines' appointment as chief. It does not mention the March 4th incident. Instead, it lists generalized criticisms and unsubstantiated doubts." The judge nodded. Entered. Amara watched Kurt's face, the crack in his poise now visible. He tried to recover, but the tone of the room had shifted. David leaned in for one final question. "Dr. Halbert, is it true that during a 2020 department review, you received a formal warning for conduct deemed disruptive to clinical cohesion?" Kurt's jaw tightened. "That's unrelated. Maybe. Or maybe it's part of a pattern, of you undermining colleagues who you feel threatened by." "Objection," the prosecution snapped. "Speculation." "Sustained," the judge said. "Let's keep to the facts, Mr. Ling. No further questions." As Kurt stepped down, he didn't look at Amara. She didn't need him to. His silence said enough. During the afternoon recess, Amara stood alone by the courthouse window, looking out over downtown Chicago. The rain had stopped. Pedestrians passed by in coats and umbrellas, heads down, focused, determined. Like she had been, for decades. Like she still was. She heard footsteps behind her. Carmen Lopez approached, holding a paper cup of coffee. "He's unraveling," Carmen said, handing it to her. "I saw. They're starting to believe you now." Amara took the coffee, warm in her hands. "They should have believed me from the beginning." Carmen didn't argue. "But they didn't. Because of how you look. Because of who you are." Amara turned from the window, her voice low. "I've worked every night shift, every holiday, every impossible case. I've walked into rooms where people assumed I was a nurse, or a tech, or just lost. And I kept showing up." "You still are," Carmen said softly. Amara nodded. "But I'm tired, Carmen." Carmen reached out, placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Then rest when this is over. But don't stop now." The courtroom door opened again. Time to return. Time to stand. Time to be seen. As she walked back in, Amara felt the exhaustion in her bones, but beneath it, something stronger. Something ancestral. The knowledge that even when doubted, dismissed, or diminished, she had always returned stronger. They called her next to the stand. Tomorrow, she would testify, and this time, she wouldn't just defend her career, she would define it. The courtroom was hushed. The kind of silence that doesn't just fall but settles, thick, heavy, expectant. Dr. Amara Gaines stepped up to the witness stand like she was entering an operating room, calm, deliberate, fully aware that every movement, every word, would be dissected. David Ling stood beside her, his tone gentle but purposeful. "Dr. Gaines," he began, "can you state your qualifications for the record?" She met the judge's eyes, her voice steady. "I received my MD from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I completed a residency in general surgery at Northwestern, followed by a fellowship in trauma surgery. I've practiced for 22 years, the last 13 at St. Catherine Medical Center, where I currently serve as chief trauma surgeon." She paused just a moment before adding, "despite what anyone might assume based on how I look." A few quiet murmurs rippled through the back rows. David smiled slightly, then continued. Can you walk us through the events of March 4th? Amara's face shifted into focus mode, the same way it did when she was recounting a trauma case. During rounds. Clinical, but human. She described the ER that night, the simultaneous arrival of 4 critical patients, the state of each one, the triage process, her reasoning, the roles assigned to each team member. The plaintiff's son was stable. His vitals were strong, his Glasgow coma scale was 15, and he was conscious. The GSW patient had already lost over a liter of blood before arrival. In trauma triage, we operate on immediacy and reversibility. That was my call, and I stand by it. David nodded. What happened after surgery? All patients survived, including the plaintiff's son. He remained in observation for 3 days and was discharged on day 4. Did anyone question your judgment at the time? No. Not until Dr. Halberd began spreading doubt, weeks later. And why do you think he did that? Amara took a breath. There are people in every institution who believe authority should look a certain way, sound a certain way. I've known since medical school that I don't fit that mold for some of them. But Kurt Halberd's resentment didn't begin with one patient. It began the day he realized I wouldn't defer to his ego. When I outperformed him. When I was promoted over him. David stepped back. No further questions. The prosecutor rose slowly, like a man preparing to walk a tightrope. He was slick and smooth, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Gaines, he began, is it fair to say that the ER on March 4th was chaotic? Yes, she replied evenly. It often is. That's the nature of trauma. And in chaos, mistakes can be made. They can. But not in this case. You're confident in that? I reviewed every chart, every scan, every vitals log. The prosecutor took a breath, then pivoted. Do you think it's possible that unconscious bias could have influenced your triage decisions? Amara blinked. Bias against whom? Well, he said, adjusting his tie, you decided to treat the gunshot victim, a man with multiple priors, before the plaintiff's son. Couldn't that be interpreted as a questionable priority? The courtroom tensed. Amara's voice was cold steel now. I treated the patient most at risk of dying in the shortest window of time. That is the only bias I carry in the trauma bay, survival probability. But some might say, do you know how many times I've treated people who didn't want to be touched by black hands? She interrupted, her eyes locked on his. How many times I've walked into rooms where I was mistaken for the janitor, or the tech, or told to get the doctor, even when my name was on the chart. I still showed up. I still saved lives. I treat every person the same. I did that night, too. The prosecutor hesitated, clearly thrown. Nothing further. The judge rubbed his temples as if something in him had started to shift, maybe discomfort, maybe understanding, or maybe just the recognition that the room was now fully hers. Amara stepped down from the stand, her back straight, her steps measured. As she returned to the defense table, David leaned toward her. You just won the jury. Let's hope I didn't just scare them, she murmured, half smiling. Later that afternoon, court adjourned early. Outside, the sky had cleared. The rain was gone, replaced by an almost blinding sunlight that made the courthouse steps glow. Amara stood for a moment at the top of the stairs, watching people come and go. Somewhere nearby, the sounds of the city surged back to life, sirens in the distance, bus brakes hissing, voices overlapping like a tide. She didn't notice the woman. At first, young, maybe late 20s, with a black medical student jacket clutched under her arm. She approached slowly, hesitantly. Dr. Gaines, the woman said. Yes? I just wanted to say, thank you for what you said in there. I'm a third year at UChicago Med. I've been doubting if there's a place for someone like me in surgery. You made me feel like maybe there is. Amara looked at her, full of sudden, unexpected emotion. There is, she said. And don't let anyone make you believe otherwise. The young woman nodded and disappeared back into the crowd. Amara turned her face up to the sun, eyes closed for a second. She was tired. So tired. But for the first time since this all began, she could see the finish line. Tomorrow, the final arguments would begin, and soon, the verdict. The night before closing arguments, Amara couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table long after midnight, surrounded by a quiet that felt more like pressure than peace. Her briefcase was still zipped, untouched since she got home. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, messages from colleagues, students, a few journalists, even former patients. Some offered encouragement. Others were thinly veiled requests for comment. She ignored them all. Instead, her eyes were fixed on an old photo on the refrigerator, faded at the corners, held by a cracked magnet. It showed her in her residency years, smiling awkwardly with 2 other interns in a hospital cafeteria. Her badge was upside down. Her white coat looked oversized. Her eyes, though, they had fire. A fire that hadn't yet learned how much It would be asked to endure. Her mother's voice still lived in the corners of this kitchen. The world won't always clap when you do the right thing, baby. But that doesn't mean you stop. Her mother had died 6 years ago, complications after a stroke. Amara had flown home in scrubs, still smelling faintly of antiseptic and sweat, not even changing before sitting at her mother's bedside. They hadn't needed many words. Everything between them had already been understood. Now, more than ever, Amara longed for her voice. A knock on the door broke the silence. When she opened it, Marcus stood there, hoodie, backpack, and that same blend of chaos and care he'd always carried. "You're lucky I love you," he said. "It's 1 a.m. Amara managed a tired laugh. "What are you doing here?" He held up a small, greasy bag. "Jerk chicken from the spot on 83rd. Still warm." She stepped aside, and he walked in like he had when they were kids, barefoot, comfortable, home. They sat at the table without speaking. He handed her a container. She opened it, and for the first time all day, she felt hunger. "I watched your testimony," he said between bites. "I was mad at first. For how come you were? For not going off when that lawyer implied you prioritized the wrong patient. But then, I got it." She looked at him. "Got what?" "That you've had to be calm for so long. Even when it's unfair. Especially then. It's the only way they let you stay in the room." Her throat tightened. She hadn't cried in days, hadn't allowed herself to, not with the weight of the case pressing on her chest like a collapsed lung. But now, with her brother, with no courtroom watching, she let a few tears slide silently down her face. Marcus reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "You don't owe them perfection, you know. You never did." "I know," she whispered. "But I also knew I'd have to give it anyway." They sat in silence for a long time, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Eventually, he fell asleep on her couch, and Amara curled up on the armchair nearby, blanket tucked around her legs. The city quiet outside. The next morning, the courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Final arguments. David Ling stood with quiet confidence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to dazzle. Instead, he told the story the way it deserved to be told, with care, with truth, with gravity. "Dr. Amara Gaines didn't choose who she is," he said, looking the jury in the eye. "But she chose who she became. A surgeon. A leader. A protector of life. And in a moment of pressure, one that most of us will never know, she made the right call. She saved lives. Including the plaintiff's son." He held up the hospital board letter. "This," he said, "is not just a defense. It's a record of her legacy. She has done the work. Again and again. And yet, one comment, one offhand line from this very bench, threatened to erase all of it." David turned slowly, letting his words settle. "This case is not just about medicine. It's about perception. About how quick we are to doubt someone who doesn't look the part. But the evidence doesn't lie. Her record doesn't lie. And neither does the truth." When the prosecutor followed, his tone was cautious. Softer than before. The strength in his case had been diluted by too many half-truths, too many cracks. He relied now on emotion, on possible alternatives, on the idea that mistakes can happen. But the room had changed. The jury had changed. And Amara could feel it. When court adjourned, the judge announced that deliberations would begin the next morning. The jury would sleep on it. Everyone else would try to. Outside, the air smelled like summer, that sharp, humid weight that Chicago wears before a storm. The plaza in front of the courthouse was half empty, just a few people lingering, voices low. Carmen was waiting by the curb. She nodded when Amara emerged. "You were powerful in there," she said. "I was just honest." Carmen smiled. "That's exactly what they're not used to." Amara looked up at the sky, the clouds thickening above the skyline. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came, she had already endured more than most people ever saw, and still, she stayed. The morning came slow and overcast, as if the city itself was holding back light. Dr. Amara Gaines sat in a quiet corner of the courthouse cafeteria, staring into a cup of coffee that had gone cold 15 minutes ago. She wasn't reading the medical journal open in front of her. She wasn't checking messages. She was waiting. The jury was deliberating. 12 strangers, none of them physicians, were somewhere upstairs deciding whether her judgment, her years of training, her entire professional identity, had been sound or reckless. Their verdict would live next to her name forever. Even if she won, the stain of accusation rarely washed off completely. David sat across from her, fiddling with a granola bar wrapper. "You know," he said softly, "most clients want me to speak for them. All the way to the end. But you took that courtroom and told your own truth." Amara looked up. "Because it wasn't just a case. It was a mirror." He nodded. "I know." She pushed the journal aside. Have you ever noticed how the word doctor still makes some people picture an older white man with a stethoscope and silver hair? David offered a dry smile. I was raised by two immigrant parents who spoke barely any English. My fourth grade teacher asked if I'd ever seen a courtroom from the other side. So yeah, I've noticed. They shared a silence not of awkwardness, but of mutual knowing, the kind built on years of pushing uphill with dignity clenched in their teeth. At 11:42 a.m., a bailiff appeared at the cafeteria entrance. They've reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed again. Not just with lawyers and press, but with quiet support, nurses from St. Catherine's, young residents, even a couple of patients Amara hadn't seen in years. People who had been touched, quite literally, by her hands. They had come without fanfare, no signs, no chanting. Just presence. Just eyes on the system that was now forced to see her, whether it wanted to or not. The judge entered. His expression was unreadable. He didn't speak until the jury had taken their seats. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, have you reached a verdict? A woman in the front row, early 60s, church-serious face, gray-streaked hair pulled into a bun, stood and spoke with quiet resolve. We have, Your Honor. And what is your verdict in the case of Halberd versus Gaines? A beat. A pause in which Amara felt the air stretch tight around her ribs. We find in favor of the defendant, Dr. Amara Gaines. A sharp exhale cut through the room, not from her, but from somewhere behind, a nurse maybe, or a patient, or someone who had held their breath too long. Amara didn't move. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes forward. But her body felt suddenly heavier, and lighter, all at once. Like a structure that had survived the quake, still standing, but changed. David leaned over, whispering, they believed you. No, she whispered back, her voice low but sure. They finally saw me. Across the aisle, Dr. Kurt Halberd's face had gone blank. No emotion. Just the small, stunned stillness of a man who had underestimated the storm he'd tried to stir. The judge cleared his throat, gaze lingering briefly on Amara. If there was remorse behind his eyes, he didn't voice it. He simply dismissed the court, and the gallery began to shift and rise like a tide released. As Amara stepped out into the hallway, applause broke out, not raucous, but warm, organic, human. She wasn't used to it. She'd spent so long being invisible in the right rooms and visible in the wrong ones that the sound of approval felt surreal. Then she saw her brother at the far end of the hall. Both fists raised in the air like he was at a concert. That's my sister, he shouted. That's the doctor they said didn't look like one. She couldn't help it, a laugh burst from her chest, cutting through the tears she'd tried to hold back. She walked to him, and he wrapped her in a hug so fierce it stole her breath. Carmen Lopez approached from behind, eyes misty. You made us proud, Amara. Thank you, Amara said, steadying herself. Now, Carmen added, you need to take a damn vacation. They laughed. For the first time in weeks, maybe longer, it felt safe to. That evening, Amara returned home to find a stack of mail on her front step. Bills, flyers, 2 thank you notes written in childlike handwriting. And one thick, official envelope from the American College of Surgeons. Inside was an invitation. Dr. Amara Gaines, MD, we are honored to invite you as keynote speaker for our annual symposium on equity, excellence, and the future of surgery. Amara sat on the front steps and read it twice, then 3 times. She looked out over her neighborhood, the sun casting long gold shadows across the sidewalks. Children played on bikes. A dog barked in the distance. Life, ordinary, beautiful, messy, continued, and for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to rejoin it. Fully. Freely. Tomorrow, there would be decisions to make, about work, about leadership, about the role her voice might play in a wider world. But tonight, she allowed herself to rest. To breathe because she had made it. Not just through the trial, but through the doubt. Through the silence. Through the wait, she had stayed, and now, finally, she was seen. 2 days after the verdict, Dr. Amara Gaines walked into St. Catherine Medical Center not through the back staff entrance like she usually did, but through the main atrium, just once, just to see how it felt. Patients shuffled in and out. Under the humming fluorescent lights. Security guards gave familiar nods. Nurses in scrubs passed by with clipboards and tired smiles. Life had gone on here while she was defending her right to belong in the very place she'd helped hold together for over a decade. It wasn't a grand return. No welcome banner. No press conference. But people noticed. Some paused. Some smiled. In a way they hadn't before, with softness, with apology. Others kept walking, unsure of what to say. That was fine with her. She didn't need the parade. She only needed the door to still be open. She took the stairs up to the 5th floor, surgical, where her name still sat etched beside the words Chief of Trauma Surgery. The title had always felt earned but heavy. Now it felt sharper. sharpened by fire. Carmen Lopez was waiting just outside the break room with 2 cups of coffee. Wasn't sure if you'd actually come today, she said. I wasn't either, Amara admitted. But my hands wanted to be busy again. You ready for the flood of consults? I think I missed it. Carmen handed her a cup. That's the part they don't tell you about vindication. You still have to clock in the next day. Amara smirked and took a sip, but as the morning wore on, she felt the shift. Not everyone was ready to move on. Some residents lingered around her too cautiously, like she might shatter if spoken to. A few senior surgeons kept their congratulations short, tight-lipped. One even called the whole trial a distraction, as though the defense of her name had been an inconvenience to workflow. And then there was the email, subject line, media inquiry, Channel 7 News. The body was short. Dr. Gaines, we're putting together a segment on women of color in medicine and would love to feature you. The trial has sparked statewide conversation about bias and accountability. Are you open to an interview? She stared at it longer than she expected to. Because it wasn't a simple ask. It was an invitation to keep being visible, when all she wanted was to return to the quiet dignity of her work. But silence had nearly cost her once. Maybe her voice mattered more now than ever. She replied with one line, I'll do it. But only if we talk about solutions, not just pain. That evening, her apartment was lit by the soft amber glow of setting sun. Marcus dropped by again, this time with a 6-pack and a not-so-subtle suggestion to just chill tonight. Amara leaned against the kitchen counter while he searched her cabinets for chips. You know they're gonna start calling you for panels, right? He said. Keynotes, interviews, podcasts. I know. And you gonna say yes? She shrugged. To some. Not all. I didn't ask to become a symbol. Marcus cracked open a beer and handed her one. Yeah, but you are now. Might as well make it count. She looked out the window, the city glowing just past the edge of the lake, blue turning slowly to indigo. I never wanted to be a story. She said softly. I just wanted to be a good doctor. You are, he said. But sometimes a good story needs a good doctor at the center of it. She smiled faintly and nodded, but deep down she knew the real work wasn't over. The courtroom had been one kind of battlefield. The hospital, the culture, the politics, the subtle exclusions, would remain another, and there was still the public. The online articles had begun to trickle in. Dr. Wynn's malpractice trial after judge questioned her appearance, bias. In the case that sparked a national conversation, Chicago surgeon reminds America what a doctor looks like. Some headlines made her cringe. Others made her ache. The language felt like an oversimplification of something far more painful and nuanced. But buried in the comment sections were messages that felt real. I'm a med student, and I cried watching her speak. I left surgery because of people. Like Halberd. Maybe I'll go back. She reminds me of my mom. She saved people and never got credit either. Amara saved those. Not for ego, but for grounding, for those future moments when the system would forget again, and she would need to remember. That weekend, she sat alone at the hospital rooftop garden. Her shift had ended, but she stayed, seeking quiet in a city that rarely offered it. Below her, the streets buzzed. Ambulances blared faintly in the distance. The same symphony of life and urgency she had grown up inside. It had shaped her, scarred her, made her extraordinary. And now it was hers again, not given, not gifted, but reclaimed. She thought of the trial. The stand. The letter. The verdict. She thought of the thousands of tiny moments before that, the late nights, the surgeries that stretched until dawn, the patients who'd never know how close they'd come to not surviving, and she thought of what it had taken just to stay. There would always be another room where someone looked at her and thought, you don't look like a doctor, but that wasn't her burden to carry anymore. She knew who she was, and now, so did they. It started with a knock on her office door, a soft, uncertain tap. Doctor. Amara Gaines looked up from her laptop. Charts were open on the screen, post-op notes half finished. Come in. A young woman stepped inside, hesitating at the threshold. She wore a white coat 2 sizes too big, a stethoscope looped around her neck like it still felt foreign. She had big eyes and short hair, a nervous grip on a clipboard. Dr. Gaines, she asked. That's me. I'm Nia, the woman said. 3rd-year med student. I'm rotating on trauma for 2 weeks. They said I should check in with you. Amara stood and offered her hand. Nice to meet you, Nia. The handshake was awkward, a little too firm, the way young professionals often overcompensate when trying to seem sure of themselves. They didn't tell me you'd be shadowing today, Amara said. I actually asked to be placed here. Amara tilted her head slightly. Oh? I watched your testimony, Nia said, her voice soft but urgent. The whole trial, actually. I was supposed to be studying for boards, but I couldn't stop. It was the first time I saw someone like me in that kind of fight, and win. Amara's heart stirred. not with pride, exactly, but with something more intimate. A quiet recognition. You want to go into surgery? She asked. I think so, Nia said. But sometimes, it feels like every hallway I walk down is trying to push me somewhere else. Somewhere safer. Less visible. Amara gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. Nia did, carefully, like she wasn't sure how long she was welcome. Amara leaned forward slightly. You're not imagining it. The system's subtle about it, but it's always nudging. Away from power. Away from risk. Toward roles where you won't make too much noise. Nia's eyes met hers, wide with something between relief and grief, but, Amara continued, you don't owe the system your silence. You owe yourself your full self. And if surgery is where your heart is, then it's your job to stay in the room. Even when it's hard. Especially then. Nia nodded, but her eyes were glassy, and one more thing, Amara added. The people who try to make you doubt? Half the time, they're only repeating what someone once told them. Break the chain. Later that day, Amara scrubbed in for her first surgery since returning. It was a complicated abdominal trauma, a car crash victim brought in during the early morning hours. Blood pressure unstable, internal bleeding suspected. Classic trauma case. The kind Amara had done so many times, her body knew the rhythm before her brain did. Carmen stood beside her at the scrub sink, tying her mask. You nervous? She asked. No. Amara said. But I'm listening harder today. To what? Everything. The team. My own instincts. The silence between words. Inside the OR, the tension snapped into place like clockwork. Monitors beeped. Gowns rustled. Nia stood at the back, just inside the doorway, wide-eyed beneath her cap and mask. Amara caught her gaze once, just briefly, and gave the smallest nod. Scalpel, clamp, suction, retractor. The moment the internal bleed revealed itself, a ruptured splenic artery, Amara moved fast, calm, precise. The same hands that had been doubted in court now worked with unquestionable confidence. She clamped, sutured, stabilized. Life retained. As they closed the patient, one of the residents spoke up from across the table. Flawless, he said under his breath. Always is. Amara didn't reply. She didn't need to, but she noticed how he said it, not with surprise, but with something closer to humility. Maybe he was one of the ones who hadn't believed before. Maybe now, quietly, he was learning. That evening, she found an envelope on her desk. No name. No return address. Just her name, handwritten. Inside was a short letter. Dr. Gaines, I was in the courtroom the day the verdict was read. I've worked in this hospital for 6 years, and I've never spoken to you, mostly because I didn't think I could. But watching you speak, watching you hold your ground, made me rethink a lot. I used to believe that staying quiet was the best way to keep my job. But now, I'm not so sure. Maybe we're supposed to do more than survive. Maybe we're supposed to make it easier for the next one coming up the stairs behind us. Thank you. You changed the air in the room. Amara folded the letter carefully and placed it in the top drawer of her desk, next to the hospital board's letter, and the invitation to speak at the surgical symposium. A small archive of truth. She sat back in her chair and looked at the fading light outside her window. The victory had come and gone. The world would move on. Headlines would fade, but here, in the hallways of this hospital, the real change was beginning, slowly, subtly, one conversation, one shift in tone at a time. She wasn't just staying anymore, she was building something, not a legacy. A pathway. The rain had returned to Chicago, not a storm, just that steady, sideways drizzle that soaks your coat no matter how fast you move. It made everything look a little older, a little more tired. The sidewalks reflected streetlights like mirrors. Cracked by time, Amara stood inside the small bookstore on South Michigan Avenue, flipping through a biography she wasn't planning to buy. She wasn't here for the book. She was here for the quiet. And for him, still pretending you read non-medical things, a voice said behind her. She turned slowly. James was there, same crooked smile, same paint-splattered jacket, same cautious warmth in his eyes. He looked both older and exactly the same. I read plenty outside medicine, Amara said, sliding the book back onto the shelf. Cookbooks don't count. Rude, she said, smirking. He laughed, then held out his hands in surrender. I'm just saying. You haven't changed. That wasn't true. She had changed more than she'd ever let anyone see, especially him. James, the architect she'd dated off and on for 3 years in her late 30s, was the only man who'd ever come close to knowing all the parts of her. But close was never quite close enough. Not when her life was structured in 24-hour call shifts and the emotional math of triage. They'd parted quietly, years ago. No screaming. No betrayal. Just a slow, silent agreement that neither of them could bridge the growing distance. He had wanted something steadier. She had needed something more sacred, solitude. What are you doing here? She asked. I heard about the trial, he said. And I knew you came here when you needed air. She raised an eyebrow. So you followed me? No, he said. I guessed. And I was right. She studied him. His kindness hadn't faded. And neither had the way he looked at her, like she was still made of quiet constellations instead of scars. Do you want to get a coffee? He asked. Just to talk. She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to, but because after so much of being seen as a case, a cause, a headline, the idea of being seen as herself again felt foreign. Still, she nodded. Okay. They sat in the corner of a small cafe across from Grant Park, steam curling from mismatched mugs. So, James said, I watched the closing arguments online. You were unbelievable. I wasn't trying to be. I know. That's what made it so hard to watch. She looked at him sharply. Hard? You were so calm, he said. So surgical. But I could see the fire under it. The pain. You were bleeding under that suit, Amara. She didn't answer right away. The sound of rain tapped against the windows like fingers too impatient to wait outside. You always said I kept parts of myself hidden, she said. You did. You thought it was about you. It wasn't. It was survival. James nodded slowly. I get that now. I do. But it doesn't make it any easier to watch someone you care about walk through fire alone. I wasn't alone, she said. I just couldn't afford to ask anyone to hold the torch with me. They sat in silence, cups warm in their hands. He finally said, Are you happy now? The question landed like a scalpel. Clean. Deep. Unavoidable. She didn't answer right away. I'm proud, she said. That's not the same as happy. But it's real. James tilted his head. Is there room now? For something else? She looked away. Out the window. At the blur of tail lights and the river of people heading home from work. Her life had been a fortress, built to protect, to survive. But lately, she'd started to wonder if she could risk building something softer. Something vulnerable, maybe, she said. I'm not sure what I have left to give. He smiled, gently. Sometimes, what's left is exactly what matters most. She nodded slowly. I'll think about it. That night, back in her apartment, Amara pulled out an old journal from the back of her closet. It still smelled faintly of old paper and eucalyptus oil from a bath she'd once taken during residency. One of the rare nights she allowed herself rest, she flipped through pages filled with cramped handwriting, surgeries, emotions, quotes from her mother, fragments of poems. But near the back, one line caught her eye. What will become of all the love I didn't have time to give? She stared at it for a long time. It was dated 8 years ago. She picked up a pen and wrote below it, maybe, it's still here. Waiting. Asking again, then she closed the journal and sat still for a long time. For the first time since the trial, she didn't feel the need to prepare for the next battle. Instead, she allowed herself to wonder what it would feel like to just live. The auditorium at Northwestern Medical Center was packed, students filled every row. Professors lingered at the back. Camera crews flanked the exits. Even the dean was seated, notebook in hand, pretending not to be impressed by the turnout. The symposium banner stretched across the stage. Equity, excellence, and the future of surgery. Keynote speaker, Dr. Amara Gaines. Amara stood behind the podium, blinking beneath the stage lights, her hands lightly gripping the sides. She'd given hundreds of talks in her career, grand rounds, surgical conferences, M&M sessions, but this was different. This time, they weren't here for medicine, they were here for her story. Her scars. Her stance. The trial had turned her into something she never asked to be, a symbol of resilience. An icon of resistance. A quiet storm that wouldn't break. And now, people wanted more. She cleared her throat and began. I was taught, early on, to speak through results. To let my work speak for itself. I believed, maybe naively, that if I was good enough, the rest would follow. She paused, but I was wrong. Results don't erase perception. Skill doesn't silence bias. And staying quiet doesn't keep you safe. It just delays the damage. The room was dead silent. She went on to describe not just the events of the trial, but the slow erosion that preceded it, the countless micro-disqualifications, the undermining. The way being difficult was often just being accurate while black, while female, while unwilling to shrink. Her words weren't polished. They weren't scripted. But they were true. When she finished, there was a moment where no one clapped, they just stood. The whole room, slowly, reverently, rose to their feet. And for a second, Amara felt something she hadn't in a long time, certainty. Not about medicine. About her place in it. Later that evening, she sat alone in her office, the applause long faded. Her inbox had exploded, media outlets, advocacy groups, hospitals offering consultant roles, and one particular message from the Chicago Medical Equity Coalition stood out. Dr. Gaines, we're organizing a national campaign for hospital accountability and anti-bias training. Your story is at the center of our pitch to Congress. We'd love you to be our face. Can we count on your voice?" She stared at the screen. Her thumb hovered over the reply button, then dropped to her lap. The weight wasn't just the ask. It was what it meant. If she said yes, she would no longer be just a doctor who survived a public trial. She would become the face of a movement, interviews, panels, pushback. And more importantly, she would no longer be able to choose her silence. But if she said no, who else would they find? Someone less ready? Someone who couldn't yet stand the fire? She was still thinking when Carmen walked in, balancing 2 takeout boxes. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just emails," Amara muttered. "Ah," Carmen said, setting down the food. "The friendly kind? Or the 'you're our next messiah' kind?" Amara cracked a weary smile. "The latter. They always want a hero after they watch you survive something they couldn't." "Exactly. Carmen, Saturday, so what's stopping you?" Amara sighed. "I've given my whole life to this system, Carmen. My whole life. And now that I survived what it tried to do to me, they want me to fix it. Publicly? Politically? Maybe," Carmen said. "Or maybe they just want you to tell the truth. And this time, not under oath." Amara didn't answer, because truth, in public, was different. It came with consequences, not just for her, but for the hospital, for the board, for the people she still had to lead. Speaking out might expose fault lines too deep to control. She was still their chief. Still in the room, and the room was still watching. That night, as she rode home in the back of a rideshare, the driver glanced at her in the mirror. "You're the doctor from TV, right?" Amara looked up. "I guess so. I just want to say, my niece is in med school now." Black girl, real sharp. "After watching your story, she told me she stopped worrying so much about her hair. Just wore it natural to her rotation. Said, if Dr. Gaines can win in court, I can show up how I am." He smiled. "Thank you for that." Amara nodded, a lump rising in her throat. "Tell her I said she's already winning." When she got home, she sat in her hallway, coat still on, purse at her side. The house was silent. She opened her laptop and wrote one sentence in a new email draft: "I'll lend my voice. But I speak on my terms." Then she hit send because maybe legacy wasn't about one verdict. Maybe it was about what you build in the silence that follows. It began with a headline, not a supportive one this time. Not the thoughtful editorial in The Atlantic or the glowing segment on local public radio. This one came from a national healthcare outlet known more for corporate spin than nuance. "Surgeon. Or activist? Some say Dr. Gaines should choose." The article was heavy with coded language, professionalism, neutrality, distractions. It cited unnamed senior hospital sources, questioning whether her new public role was compatible with administrative responsibility. It suggested her speaking out was creating discomfort among donors and department heads. By the third paragraph, the message was clear: she was too loud. Amara read the article in her office before sunrise, the only light coming from the city outside and the glow of her monitor. The hospital hadn't said anything to her directly, yet. But the silence from leadership had its own sharpness. No congratulations after her congressional roundtable appearance. No comment after her viral speech about surgical equity. Just absence. She'd seen this before. The slow, polite distancing. The quiet repositioning of power behind closed doors. She had been here once, on the edges of exclusion, just with better tailoring this time. When Carmen walked in at 7:15 with her usual coffee drop, Amara slid the laptop around so she could see the headline. Carmen read it silently, then set down the coffee with more force than usual. "Let me guess, written by someone who's never been mistaken for a nurse in their own or?" Amara smiled tightly. "Or asked if they were lost in a board meeting." "What do you want to do?" "Let it sit," Amara said. "Let's see who calls, who avoids me, who changes their tone." Carmen nodded. "They'll try to reframe you as the problem. They already have." By the following week, the calls began, quiet, cautious invitations to clarify her position, and the board chair requested a private conversation. Just to realign expectations. A senior colleague asked her if she could scale back the advocacy, just for a few months, to keep the department stable. And one particularly bold administrator said, with a polished smile, "You're incredible, Amara, but you're starting to make people nervous. That's not leadership. That's disruption." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam a door. But she replied with a precision colder than any scalpel: "Maybe disruption is exactly what leadership looks like when the system's broken." The administrator blinked, rattled. "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant," Amara said. "I'm just not pretending anymore." But even courage has a cost. Late one night, she received an email from a trusted mentee. A promising fourth-year student named Gabrielle. Dr. Gaines, I've been advised to find a different trauma elective. Apparently, some faculty are concerned about the culture shift in your department. They didn't say it directly, but I know it's because I cited your trial in a class discussion on bias. I'm heartbroken. I thought things were changing. What should I do? Amara sat in her kitchen reading the message, rage and grief pressing against her ribs like a vice. They were doing what institutions always did, punishing proximity. Not just to the woman who fought back, but to anyone brave enough to stand beside her. She replied carefully, knowing Gabrielle would read her words like oxygen. You didn't do anything wrong. They're just afraid of what you represent, the future. Keep going. Take the elective elsewhere, if you must. But stay the course. When this passes, and it will, I'll be here, still holding the door open, and she meant it. But after sending the email, she sat in the dark and let herself cry. Not out of defeat, but out of the cruel clarity that change, real change, was lonelier than she had expected. By month's end, she received a formal letter from the hospital's executive committee. It wasn't a threat, not technically. It was filled with neutral phrases, strategic balance, institutional cohesion, preserving focus. But the message was unmistakable. She could keep her role as chief. Or she could keep speaking out. But not both. Amara stared at the letter for a long time. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. You still breathing in there? Saw the article. Saw the hate. Just say the word and I'm outside with a megaphone and a t-shirt that says, I told you so. She smiled through a tear. Then came another message, from the Coalition for Medical Equity, the group she'd agreed to support. Dr. Gaines, we've secured a seat on the National Advisory Panel for Health Disparities. You've been nominated. It's yours, if you want it. It comes with visibility. And enemies. But also real power. And a platform. We'll support you. Loudly, Amara stared at both screens. Her hospital role, carefully built over years of sacrifice, hung in one hand. A national voice, a seat at the table that shaped policy, hung in the other. It was no longer a question of what she could do. It was a question of who she was ready to become. She closed both messages, then opened a blank document on her screen. Titled it, Resignation Letter, Draft. And began to write, not because she had lost, but because she was finally ready to choose herself. The hospital parking lot was quiet in the early morning light, that still gray-blue before the sun decided whether or not to rise. Dr. Amara Gaines sat in her car, engine off, hands resting gently on the steering wheel. She hadn't told many people, just Marcus, Carmen, a few close colleagues she trusted not to try to talk her out of it. She knew the rumors would spread within hours of her announcement. She could already hear the whispers. Did you hear? She left. Walked away from a chief position. She's going political now, I think. Sad, really. But it wasn't sad. Not to her. It was sacred. The resignation letter had been short. Just 2 paragraphs. I am stepping down from my role as Chief of Trauma Surgery at St. Catherine Medical Center, effective immediately. I leave not in defeat, but in clarity, knowing that the system I serve deserves not just better leadership, but bolder truth. I will be using my voice to help build what comes next. I do this for the patients, the students, and the ones watching, who still don't see themselves reflected in power. She'd attached no resume, no plan. She didn't need to, she already had her next steps. The news broke by midday. Dr. Amara Gaines resigns, hospital hero turns advocate. From Moore to Washington, Gaines accepts national equity post we asked her to choose. She did. Some pieces were gracious. Others petty. Some congratulated her. Others called it abandoning the field. But she didn't read most of them. Her focus had already shifted. By the end of the week, she was on a train to D.C. to attend her first policy roundtable with the Department of Health and Human Services. She brought only a carry-on, a worn notebook, and the letter the hospital board had written on her behalf during the trial, a reminder of how quickly institutions can change their tone depending on who's watching. In the days that followed, she sat on panels with legislators, medical historians, and ethicists. She pushed for language and funding bills that included race, gender, and class as operational metrics. She told hard truths in rooms that weren't used to hearing them. And when the reporters swarmed after her first keynote speech, she didn't flinch. My goal, she said into a dozen microphones, is not to shame medicine. It's to remake it. But her days weren't all politics. Some mornings, she taught young residents via Zoom, a pilot program she helped launch for underrepresented students in surgical rotations. The course was titled, When They Doubt You, The Unwritten Rules of Walking into the Room. She didn't sugarcoat anything. But she also didn't let them internalize what wasn't theirs to carry. You don't have to shrink to be welcome, she said in one session. You just have to be strong enough to make others uncomfortable while staying whole. They listen like their lives depended on it. Maybe they did. 2 months later, Amara returned to Chicago for a speaking event at a local university. She arrived early and slipped into the back of a lecture hall where a surgical ethics class was already in session. The professor didn't see her at first. Neither did the students. But one young woman at the front, Nia, did. She blinked twice, then smiled, then sat up straighter. Amara watched as the class discussed a case study about a misdiagnosed internal bleed, nearly identical to the one from her own trial. Nia raised her hand. What if the attending had been dismissed because of appearance or assumed competence? She asked. Do we account for that bias in our evaluations? The room paused. The professor answered carefully. That's a critical point. And one the medical field is still learning to confront. Amara smiled and slipped back out before they saw her. It was enough to know the questions were finally being asked. That evening, she met Marcus for dinner, a rooftop spot overlooking the lake, the city lights stretching out like circuitry. He clinked his glass against hers. To building new things, he said, to not needing permission, she added. They laughed. Talked about their childhood. Their mother. Her laugh. The way she used to say, your dignity is your inheritance. Don't spend it too cheap. Amara leaned back in her chair, letting the breeze sweep across her face. Do you miss it? Marcus asked. The hospital? Yeah. The title. The walls you knew. She thought for a moment. I miss the work. The medicine. The team, she said. But not the silence. Not the shrinking. Not the rooms where I had to prove myself just to be heard. She looked out at the water, her voice softer now. I thought I'd feel lost without the role. But I don't. I feel returned. Returned to what? She smiled. To myself. Weeks later, a girl in a white coat stopped Amara in a Baltimore airport. Are you Dr. Gaines? I am. I watched your trial with my mom. She's a nurse. She cried when the verdict came in. You helped me believe there's space for me in this world. Amara nodded gently, placing a hand on the young woman's shoulder. Then make it bigger. And pull others in with you. And with that, she turned and walked toward her gate, not as someone escaping anything, but as someone walking toward the horizon she'd once only imagined. No longer just a doctor. No longer just a symbol, but a builder. Of space. Of truth. Of a future worthy of the ones still watching.